All right, this is Jeremy Rothkushel,
And this is Greg McCarran.
and this is the Antidote. And today we're doing a recording of an Antedote Deepcore text, basically a continuation of the Iraq War analysis. And we're moving on to one more single text titled Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler, which will be a continuity of our readings from the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt, specifically Chapter 8, about the transformation of the Middle East in the Iraq War. And then after this, we will then do an additional recording on the Clean Break text.
Yes, and hopefully through a combination of these texts and combination of the material from the text and the whatever analysis we can provide as we're reading, and then after the fact, we'll hopefully just go with the goal of at least giving our perspective of where we see the evidence is leading to the actual serious at the deepest levels architecture of and framing of and of the American, the British, the coalition, whatever you want to call it, entrance into the Iraq War and the consequences of it that are still felt to this day. So hopefully, through this series and through these texts, a better understanding of where I think the evidence does appear to point to in terms of like the real architects with the real motivations for getting us into this catastrophe and why it still matters to this day. So
I still find it stunning how little has been spoken about this book and what Gary Vogler writes here. Because, I mean, for all we've been told and all of the propaganda all which ways around the Iraq War, with the question of the war for oil, there's never been I can't think of another big international event, war, that's been more associated with oil in the minds of the public than the Iraq War. And bam, here comes the tell-all book of the guy who was part of the Pentagon's Iraq oil planning, and basically saying he had more than 10 years after the fact, he had this stunning encounter with what he didn't know or what he didn't realize about what had gone down and the architecture of what it meant. And basically it's been, he was on Rachel Maddow, but before he wrote this book, right, Greg? Is that right?
I believe so. It was, I believe you had alerted me to this. It was it was a 10th anniversary program on the Iraq War, I believe, which would have been March of 2013, if my timeline is correct here.
And the actual journalistic data, primary, this is a primary source. He was there. You could say he's gotten some stuff wrong, but this is a serious high-level primary source, name, credentials, all identified, out in public, put out. I look on the back of this book, Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. First of all, I see University Press of Kansas.
By the way, real quick correction. I believe the actual program, it appears, aired in February of 2014. It was something that interviews have been done for it in 2013, but it did not air directly on the anniversary of the Iraq War, but rather in early 2014, it appears. So.
All right. Thank you, Greg. And basically the most thorough response to this book that I've seen is, I think it's Alison Weir. And it's almost not written about almost anywhere else. And she definitely did the best sort of distilling of what was some of the key points in all there. But I look on the back of the book here at University Press of Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas 66045. The first quote here on the back is by Jay Gardner, retired Lieutenant General of the U.S. Army. Quote, "This important book provides the reader with a mosaic of the Iraq oil story from 2002 to 2011. It is written by the one American who experienced and contributed to all of it. Gary Vogler describes the details of our country's pre-war oil planning, followed by the challenges of executing those plans once inside of Iraq. As a former Army officer and oil industry executive, Vogler was uniquely qualified to be the senior oil advisor to both the U.S. coalition and the newly formed Iraqi government. His advice, experience, and leadership was instrumental in restarting the Iraqi oil sector. This is a must-read for all senior military and foreign service officers, unquote, by Jay Gardner, retired Lieutenant General, U.S. Army. I think he was deeply involved in Iraq, right? And, and also, by the way, Gary Vogler also tells you that the Doug Feist group in the Pentagon against Pentagon security put in his boy, Michael Makovsky, the current head of the Jewish Institute of National Security of America, changed from affairs. Oh, and by the way, Makovsky is very likely 98% sure, maybe probably more, by U.S. intelligence. He is an Israeli intelligence officer. I can't believe this has not been spoken about. All right, but let's read it. So this is going to be a little bit thorough on the details and the data, but we have a feeling that this data should be spoken out there, and it should be available to people who want to listen to the details, so you can figure out what the heck went down.
Yeah, absolutely, without question. And one more correction: the exact date of the aforementioned Maddow program. It was a special episode of the Rachel Maddow show. Why we did it regarding the U.S. entry into the Iraq War, and people were interviewed about it. And the exact date of it was it aired on March 6, 2014. It was the episode of the Rachel Maddow show. Gary Vogler interviewed alongside such luminaries as Miss L. Paul Bremer. So if you can see like the combination of maybe some of the better and not so good sources on reasons for U.S. Entry into the Iraq War. And we're going to link, I found this article. I'm going to link to an article from a website called the Shepherdstown Chronicle, an article from November 2nd, 2018. Gary Vogler questions agenda behind Iraq War during President's Lecture Series, and actually goes over Vogler's, at least his description of like his own history of going from basically not seeing a negative agenda behind the Iraq War, to being forced to question it through like his own research and some findings that he made in research for the book that we're about to read from. So
that's awesome. That's great context on the source. I appreciate that, Greg.
Okay.
All right. So we'll go to chapter 2. So similarly, as we focused in terms of the nature of our analytical interests in these details, in terms of the Israel lobby, we focused on chapter 8 to start with. We're going to just focus on chapter 2 now, of Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. Oh, by the way, here on the back here, look, I'm very appreciative of the University Press of Kansas here. This is like right around the corner, putting out this book, dude. And just really stunned how, this is a key piece. This is like the most high level data about, oh, you actually want to know, or do you want to do the whole line of, I guess we'll never know? Maybe we could actually learn about the question of, well, how did the Iraq War happen? Who did it and why? Oil? Israel? Yes. All right, let's figure it out. Okay, chapter 2, page 14 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. Contingency planning for the oil sector. Quote, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." Popular proverb. In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Bush administration was criticized for a lack of pre-war planning for Iraq after the hostilities. The oil planners took exception when it came to the Iraq oil sector. The planning for the oil sector was good. About 95% of Iraq's foreign revenues came from oil sales. If the oil did not flow, then Iraq did not have an economy. It would have been irresponsible not to plan for reconstructing the oil sector. What were the legal obligations of the United States in regard to Iraq's natural resources, especially oil, after becoming an occupying power? What must the United States do under international law as an occupying power? What may the United States do? The Bush administration started thinking about these and other similar questions in 2002 as the drums for war started beating louder. There's a footnote there. An interagency planning cell, CENTCOM staff, and eventually the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers developed a contingency plan in late 2002 and early 2003. In retrospect, more than 10 years later, it was a good plan. My first full workday with the Interagency Planning Group was Friday, October 25th, 2002. Mike Mobbs mentioned that our name was the Energy Infrastructure Planning Group, EIPG. The word quote-unquote oil could not be used in the name. The word was deemed too sensitive to be placed on the outside door of the Planning Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, SCIF, on the ground floor of the A Ring in the Pentagon. That was the first indication that there was a lot of sensitivity to any optics, public sentiment, concerning the Iraqi oil sector. The Bush administration consistently downplayed an oil motive for attacking Iraq. Also, the work had to be kept very confidential so as not to undermine any diplomatic efforts being undertaken. EIPG was organized as an interagency planning cell reporting to the National Security Council, NSC. Stephen Hadley, Frank Miller, and Pam Quanrud were our contacts at the NSC. Pam Quanrud was our primary contact. The State Department, Department of Energy, CIA, and Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy provided members for this cell. The formal reporting was to the NSC. However, reporting to Doug Feith's office took place before sharing anything with the NSC. Specifically, Abe N. Shulsky, and Doug Feith reviewed our work at the Pentagon. I. Lewis Scooter Libby was the chief of staff for Vice President Cheney. Libby reviewed our work on occasion. Their comments were incorporated into any documents before they were shared with the NSC. Agency representatives on the team shared them with their specific agencies. EIPG consisted of 8 full-time participants, 1 part-time participant, and several people that were brought in at various times for specific reasons. The following were the 8 full-time participants. Michael Mobbs, Group Lead, reported to Doug Feith, Undersecretary for Policy. Clark Turner, Department of Energy. Seneca Johnson, State Department. Frosty, CIA. Michael Makovsky, Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Barbara Glotfelty, DoD Procurement Contracting Officer. Matt Amatrano, DoD Contractor, Administrative Assistant. Gary Vogler, DoD Independent Contractor. Michael Mobbs graduated from Yale University in the early 1970s and later received his law degree from the University of Chicago Law School. From 1982 until 1985, Mike served as the Secretary of Defense representative to the Strategic Arms Reduction talks for Assistant Secretary Richard Pearl. It was during this time that Mobbs first worked with Doug Feith. In December 1985, President Reagan appointed Mobbs as Assistant Director, Strategic Programs of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. In 1987, Mobbs left the Reagan administration and joined the law firm of Feith and Zell, located in Washington, D.C. Mobbs spent several years in Russia in the late 1990s, working in the private sector, returning to D.C. before the Bush administration. Very interesting. Right, Greg? This is sort of...
Yeah. And by the way, what is the spelling on this man's name?
Mobbs?
Yes.
Mobbs. Michael
Okay,
Mobbs.
Michael Mobbs. Okay, thank you.
For sure. All right, so... Oh, yeah. Mobbs, the group lead, spent several years in Russia in the late 1990s working in the private sector, returning to D.C. before the Bush administration. Doug Feith was confirmed by Congress and appointed as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the spring of 2001. Feith then approached Mobbs and others about joining his team at the Pentagon. The original plan was to bring in 4 experienced people with whom Feith had gained confidence: Abe Shulsky, Sven Kramer, Michael Pillsbury, and Mike Mobbs. This group would act as a quote-unquote think tank for Feith and be assigned strategic projects by the undersecretary. Then 9/11 hit. The think tank plan was overcome by events. OBE is the military term. Okay, this is the Antedote Deepcore Text. This is Jeremy Rothgershell here with Greg McCarran. We are reading Chapter 2 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. Top of page 16. Quote, OBE is the military term. All 4 were quickly brought on board. They received security clearances and were placed into positions. Mobbs started in November 2001. Mike Mobbs came from a family where all the male members had served in the military. He was the first who did not serve in uniform. His father fought in World War II along with his uncles. His son, also named Mike, was a freshman at Tulane University in the spring of 2001, but wanted something different in his life. He wanted to be a Navy SEAL or an Army Ranger. Mike Jr. quickly joined the Army Rangers after the 9/11 attacks. The Army sent him to hotspots in the War on Terror during 2002. Mobbs knew that his son would be one of the first soldiers entering Iraq if a war started. Mobbs had skin in the game. Mobbs denied that his son's military service influenced his thinking during EIPG, but I firmly believe that it had to have some impact. His objectivity, criticism, and voice of reason among a group of political appointees rushing to war were commendable. He pushed back against those that did not have any skin in the game. Mobbs mentioned to me that he was never personally convinced that the war was necessary or that war was the right decision. No one ever asked his opinion, and it was not his job to give such an opinion. There's a footnote there, too. Clark Turner was the Department of Energy representative on the team. He was the director of the Rocky Mountain Oil Testing Center, RMOTC facility in Casper, Wyoming. Clark was originally from New York, graduated from the Colorado School of Mines in the early 1980s, and joined the U.S. Army for several years as a petroleum management officer. He had excellent petroleum supply experience in Korea and during Desert Storm in 1991. After leaving the Army, Clark joined the Department of Energy and eventually became a director in Wyoming. The RMOTC had more than 1,000 oil-producing wells in 2002. The EIPG team valued Turner's experience in the military as well as in the Department of Energy. We worked closely together until his return to RMOTC in July 2003. One distinguishing physical characteristic of Clark was a limp in his gait. Clark belonged to a small and very blessed group of individuals, survivors of grizzly bear attacks. An attack left one mangled, saved only for after several months in a hospital and multiple surgeries. I felt a common quote-unquote survivor attribute with Clark that contributed to my confidence in him. Seneca Johnson was the State Department representative on the team. She was a Foreign Service Officer, FSO, with several years' experience in the Bureau of Near East Affairs at the State Department. Seneca did not go to Iraq initially. She was pregnant with her son. However, she later took an important assignment in Baghdad during 2011 as Ambassador James Jeffrey's Chief of Staff. Seneca had the most U.S. government Middle East experience of anyone on our team. I always sought out her opinion and placed high value on it. When I asked her opinion of what I thought was a rush to war mentality, she made a prophetic comment. She quoted the popular proverb that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That comment came to my mind many times over the next decade, especially in 2006 and 2007, when Iraq was imploding. The representative from the CIA was a person known as Frosty. His complete name is intentionally not being mentioned. Frosty brought an enormous amount of Iraq oil sector intelligence to the team. His personality and chemistry match very well with Clark and me. His value to our team cannot be overstated. Barbara Glotfelty was a DoD professional with more than 20 years in the civil service. She was our contracting officer and assigned to our team by the DoD Acquisitions Group. Michael Makovsky joined the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the summer of 2002. He reported to Abe Shulsky. In his late 30s, Mike was a young person whose background in oil and gas was minimal. He was always open to discuss his religion, Orthodox Judaism, and his youth in St. Louis, especially Cardinals baseball. We had many interesting and informative discussions on both subjects. However, Makovsky was secretive about his adult life and spoke only of his recent PhD schooling. Clark Turner and I approached Makovsky early about his oil and gas background so that we could better understand his role on the team. Makovsky's response was that he was assigned to the team because he was Doug Feith's brother-in-law. That was not the case. What the heck, dude? We took that response to mean his background was none of our concern. We eventually learned that his limited oil and gas experience was working for a small oil trading firm somewhere in the Northeast for a short period. Mike Mobbs said that when he was appointed as the head of EIPG, he looked for anyone with any experience in oil and gas in OSD policy. He was told that Makovsky had contacts in the oil industry, so Mobbs agreed to take him. Mobbs mentioned during my interview with him in 2015 that the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, helped place Makovsky in Shulsky's group during the summer of 2002. That's footnoted. Although Makovsky's experience was limited, Mike Mobbs and the team used his strengths in a positive way to contribute to our success. Makovsky was smart and had good writing skills. We perceived that he had some type of personal relationship with Feith and Wolfowitz. He encouraged this perception by frequently mentioning their names. Makovsky told us that Feith had helped him with his PhD and his publication on Winston Churchill. Clark and I were skeptical of his proclaimed close relationship to Feith, but we could not identify any other sponsor. Okay, this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel here with Greg McCarran. We are doing an Antedote Deepcore Text reading from Chapter 2 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil and Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. And we have reached the top of page 18. Greg, anything you want to add right now, or should I just keep going?
It's interesting that you're already sensing a pattern of Michael Makovsky, and we've talked about Makovsky before. I'm sure we'll talk about him again in the future, but you're already sensing, getting the impression that like this is a man who is very less than forthright, to say the least, regarding a combination of his background and his connection to these to this key core of operatives and propagandists that we identified in our previous programs as being very central to this to the propaganda portion of the insertion of the U.S., the quote-unquote justification for the entrance into the war in Iraq. And you're sensing here with Makovsky just at the very least a lack of forthrightness regarding who he is, his expertise or lack thereof in the field of oil as it relates to this and overall in general. So this is interesting that in a number of ways we've already sensed, like already identified just a complete lack of detail or any serious attempts to like actually try to explain what his real motives are vis-a-vis his being placed in a role here right at the center of this whole operation that's being described here in terms of Iraq and oil and all that. So
I mean, it's sort of wild, actually, because he's not only being secretive and not forthcoming and honest, he's also being sort of haughty or, basically none of your business. All you need to, I'm Doug Feith's brother-in-law or whatever it was.
And interesting, you have identified AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, of course, the core the core of like what we identify, as the Israel lobby and sort of this influence within Congress and within government, and Makovsky being, a APAC basically pressure to put him in there. And then also it seems that maybe like Makovsky, for anybody who wants to like wonder why this guy who probably shouldn't be involved in this stuff is involved, like it seems like he just invoked the names almost as like yeah, you look at who I'm connected to, you leave me alone, and you don't question me. So that's kind of the impression. Maybe that's not, but that was like I got that a little bit from like this is a guy who's gonna like use the names of like the powerful people that are brought him in and want him in there as a means to like just stave off any type of critiques or scrutiny or criticism of his motivations or whatever he's up to or whatever he's not being so upfront about. So,
And what would Bill Clinton say? Who's the GD Empire?
Who's the damn superpower here? I thought we were the superpower.
Oh my gosh!
I
dude.
believe that was in response to Netanyahu, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, but of course, Netanyahu had the goods on him. He'd already, totally compromised by the Epstein Maxwell network. They had Amdocs all up in his comms and running through his residence at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Netanyahu, of course, is like, like, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do, Bill? So. And we'll return soon, actually, to the question of mega. And Kirby Summers has put out some interesting hypotheses that relates to about the Biden administration, of course, and Blinken and who Blinken was talking about as he came into Secretary of State and the close connection to Maxwell and all of that. So there's an interesting hypothesis there that would refocus mega as not just the group, but not, and also possibly a person in the Clinton White House. I mean, to me, it looks like there's a group of people in the Clinton White House that were likely Israeli intelligence assets. And then there was this extra governmental transnational actual mega group with people like Wexner and all of them. So, we'll return to that because, of course, that sits in that's the covert history of the lead up to 9/11 and the Iraq War and the War on Terror and all of that too. So you're not going to find any of that all together in a single book per se, in terms of stitching it together about what it all means and how this all went down and who's still operating for which interests. But these are key pieces of it. And I mean, one last thing is, this Makovsky guy who's inserted with very little experience at the highest levels of Pentagon to reconstruct, help, manage the Iraqi oil sector post 2003 invasion. And he's just sort of forced in there by Feith and AIPAC. He doesn't have to answer to anybody but Feith, and obviously to AIPAC, and obviously who's ever managing that whole intelligence operation, right? And Makovsky is Jinsa. So you would think that the question about policing, Jinsa is the group, really. If there were a single group, beyond the ADL in terms of police training in Israel, in the immediate wake of September 11th. And you see an escalation of at the very, very least, the psychology of occupation amongst the command level staff across the entire nation's police forces. Of course, it's way beyond training. It's about mentality and psychology. And this was what was going down in the wake of this false flag operation. And Makovsky is at the head of the organization that facilitated that whole trade from the get-go. Jinsa. And he was, there just not answering to anybody but Feith and AIPAC. And Mobs, by the way, here, right? His background, he has quote unquote skin in the game, as Vogler says. He's brought into this network via Pearl, it looks like. And he's trying, he has opinions, but they're not interested in them. And so who ultimately was managing this group? Was it Mobs? No.
Well, for what it's worth, I pulled up, I was looking at Michael Mobs' name, and for what it's worth, I pulled up, I was able to find an article from 2004 in the Washington Post where it describes Mobs as playing a key role in getting oil contracts given to Halliburton. So it looks like he may have come through for some of his friends after all in some aspects. So, but
Well, right, Cheney and Libby were helping operate this thing too.
yeah, and the name Michael Pillsbury was mentioned. I don't know if he's mentioned again, but he's a key player in terms of like the whatever the bigger picture that's going on in terms of like the right wing neocon war on terror network in terms of as it relates to China. So I don't know if he'll pop up again, but Pillsbury, from an extended level with his connections to this same grouping, is a key figure in terms of in a bigger picture narrative as it relates to China. I don't know if his name will come up again, but that is an important name, I think, for people to at least have a basic understanding of, or
Crucial,
at
Greg.
least to know the name of Michael Pillsbury. So
Thank you for bringing that up. And actually, I think we probably should return to Pillsbury uh, in the coming future, specifically around understanding China, the China stance, Trump and China especially, but also the current arc of the U.S. China stance. And Pillsbury is probably a singular figure, actually, in terms of all of that. But there's a whole understanding this aspect too, in combination with that. I think will probably bring some enlightening facts to Pillsbury's involvement in American foreign policy stance over decades, actually. All right, chapter 2 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil: An Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler, page 18, top of it. Quote, Makovsky seemed to have good information to support his inner circle relationships. Here are some examples. During an early discussion of possible Iraqis to lead the oil ministry, Makovsky removed Dr. Ahmed Chalabi from our short list for consideration. There were bigger plans for Chalabi. I don't know which way. I'll say Chalabi. Makovsky said that Chalabi was supposed to be the first post-Saddam prime minister. This was the first of many experiences I had that pointed to Chalabi being the appointed post-Saddam leader of Iraq. Chalabi was the controversial leader of the Iraqi National Congress, INC, which provided much of the false intelligence to the United States about the existence of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. That's footnoted. Wolfowitz and Feith promoted Chalabi, but they never convinced Rumsfeld to publicly support their selection. Secretary Rumsfeld would later deny in his book that he had selected any specific Iraqi to lead Iraq. Footnote. Next point, after a senior foreign services officer, Tom Warwick, was invited to EIPG for an enlightening discussion on the State Department's oil work in Iraq, Makovsky let us know that Tom was despised by Wolfowitz and Feith and should not be invited back to the Pentagon. Oh my gosh. Tom had led an independent State Department, quote, Future of Iraq, unquote, project, networking with Iraqi expatriates other than Chalabi's INC group to study various sectors of Iraq, including oil. But an aside here, by the way, Greg, that sort of sounds like actually like the similar operation that went down with the quote unquote Israeli perspective on the Iraq war. And the only person who sat down and was berated Congress was Bibi Netanyahu. It sort of sounds like the same network is managing both of the limits here, but the limit of potential Iraqi leadership, and then who is going to give the quote unquote Israeli perspective on the Iraq war.
that's interesting. You've got, the making the case for the war, and at the same time, it appears that like anybody who's like involved in these key aspects of this particular element of this push for war and push for control over the varying narratives as it relate to things such as like of this oil perspective automatically has to be filtered through the lens of these these hardline propagandists who have extremely vested interest in making sure the United States enters into this or at least enters into Iraq to wage war. So you're seeing once again. This is another example that it's a very particular group of operatives. With I would say it does appear to be some semblance or another of at least maybe dual allegiance to this foreign entity that is very much at the heart of pushing it. And once again, you see that it's not even just like, Israel itself per se, or any like, or even all like even American political figures who may identify as Zionists. It seems to be a very particular core of people with a particular vested agenda that in many cases even goes against a lot of like other, even other people who would identify as Zionists and pro-Israel. So
Yeah, I mean, this is also, I'd say, this is basically proof of conspiracy at some level in terms of the actuality in terms of the federal law. I doubt it's actually legal in terms of national security law for an officer of a foreign intelligence services to be inserted into the covertly inserted, not like it was recognized, like it was a foreign attaché who was openly recognized as giving advice, like when the Israeli generals came to the Pentagon, something like that. No. This is basically what's likely a covert Israeli intelligence officer, a scion, basically, right? Because like St. Louis born, then Aliyah to Israel post graduation, likely sheep dip then into or not sheep dip, but brought into Israeli intelligence services under the guise of foreign services in terms of Makovsky, and then brought back into the United States to be inserted into this Pentagon. That's a national security conspiracy in plain post sight, in hindsight. So it also shows you how these kinds of things can happen. That's high level of, there's some aspect. This is obviously pointing at some kind of high level Israeli intelligence cell insertion here going on. And so that shows how these kinds of things happen. So it becomes not that difficult to begin to understand how something like September 11th could be run through bureaucracies with very few people fully engaged, and even fewer people who should have been in the know, and look at it after the fact and be like, oh, that didn't make sense after the fact. So this is how conspiracy is structuralized in a way that virtually, all of the large, the sort of controlled left dissidents, archetypally Noam Chomsky, try to undermine in terms of analysis. It's just an ethnic lobby. Greg, what would Noam Chomsky say about this?
It's just an ethnic lobby. And anybody, much like anybody, can go online for a couple hours and consider themselves an expert on science. Anybody could go online for 2 hours and consider themselves an expert in foreign diplomacy and propaganda leading to war.
Thank you, Noam. We're going to continue reading the primary text here from Gary Vogler, who was there on the scene. But I appreciate your input. Okay, back to page 18 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. This is Jeremy Roth-Gushel with Greg McCarran on Antedote Deepcore Text, reading about the Iraq War. All right, page 18, chapter 2. We just heard from Tom Warwick from the State Department, a Foreign Services officer who had people other than Ahmed Chalabi. There was a diversity of possibilities for Iraqi leadership. And Makovsky let the team know that Tom was despised by Wolfowitz and Feith and should not be invited back to the Pentagon. Next point, quote, after Makovsky returned from being a backbencher at a high-level OSD meeting between civilians and senior general officers, he mentioned that the generals did not want to go to war. This comment took me by surprise, as if going to war were something that military people should enjoy. His comment immediately prompted a speech from me on the seriousness of going to war, but it also let me know that he was probably just echoing the senior leadership tone of Feith and Wolfowitz. Next point. Battles between DoD and DOS were not only at high levels, but also at lower levels when the opportunity became available. After a meeting with State Department Foreign Service officers, when Michael Rubin, an OSD colleague of Makovsky, abrasively dominated the meeting. Makovsky let us know that Rubin was the junkyard attack dog. Next point. There was widespread distribution of an unclassified report from the CIA on possible scenarios for Iraqi society after the fall of Saddam. It depicted a high probability of tribalism, sectarianism, and violence. Makovsky let us know that any reports like this should never officially be shared with Feith and Wolfowitz. Okay, that's the end of that segment with the points. Those are data points. Now we're on page 19 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. Quote, Makovsky had problems getting a security clearance. Walking into our skiff one day, he was visibly angry about something. I asked what was bothering him. He said that he had his third security interview for his top secret security clearance, and the Pentagon security team wanted more information from him. Quote, 3 interviews, I said. Wow, you are the first person I have ever met that required more than 1 interview. You must have an interesting past, unquote. He responded that Pentagon security was interested in his friends in Israel and that he was going to fight about this problem. His top secret security clearance was approved about a week later. The mystery of Mike Makovsky's background was partially solved in 2005. During the summer of 2005, a person who had worked with me in Iraq and was familiar with the problems with Makovsky during the summer of 2003 sent me some internet information. The internet blog referenced a St. Louis Post interview written on Makovsky in 1989. The Post article discussed Mike's plan to, quote, launch a career in Israel's foreign service, unquote. The interview also mentioned that, quote, he'll have to serve a stretch in the Israeli army before entering the country's foreign service, unquote. Footnoted. My contacts within our government's intelligence agency told me that Israel's quote-unquote foreign service could mean the Israeli intelligence, Mossad. The tone of the article highlights a 25-year-old American male who wanted to commit his future to the country of Israel. The article quotes him, quote, but I have strong feelings about helping to build a Jewish state, unquote. As a military man myself, I personally respect anyone who swears allegiance and their life to their country. Upon seeing this article and remembering the problems that Phil Carroll and I had with Mike in the summer of 2003, I immediately phoned Phil to see if he was aware of Makovsky's background. It was during this conversation with Phil that I learned that Mike's top secret security clearance was awarded to him because Doug Feith, quote unquote, trumped the questions and concerns of the Pentagon security investigators. It was the first time I realized that such actions were even legal. The next time I saw Makovsky after reading the Post article was in December 2005 at a meeting at the State Department. When I asked about his service in the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, his response was that he refused to confirm or deny such accusations. It sounded as if he had lawyered up. There was an AIPAC espionage scandal that was occurring at the time in Feith's office at the Pentagon. Lawrence Franklin was sentenced in January 2006 to 12 years for espionage-related charges. Franklin worked in Feith's Northern Gulf Directorate. Footnoted. This may have been why Makovsky sounded so guarded. Unlike the other EIPG team members, Makovsky refused to go to Iraq, remaining at the Pentagon in a junior staff position under Doug Feith. He had a different agenda, and his agenda proved to be a distraction to our mission. Several incidents corroborate this impression, and they will be discussed later in the book, such as how Makovsky verbally attacked the head of the Iraqi oil ministry, Thamir Gadban, and threatened Major General David Petraeus in the summer of 2003 regarding Syrian oil products. He was also quoted in a book by Steve Call as saying that his high-priority project in the summer of 2003, the Haifa pipeline, was in response to an Israeli request. Footnoted. Clark Turner said that Makovsky was different from other young staffers brought in by political appointees he had worked with in the DOE. Mike tried to bully people, but there was nothing behind his bravado. Quote, his interest was Syria and especially the pipeline going through Syria from Iraq, unquote, Clark said, footnoted. We had one EIPG participant who worked part-time. He maintained a desk in our skiff, and his name was Mark Feldman. He had worked at the State Department in the 1970s and joined the law firm of Feith and Zell in the late 1980s. He participated in team meetings when he was present. It was not clear if this work was done pro bono or if he was a paid consultant reporting directly to Doug Feith. There was a group of individuals periodically brought in by Mike Mobbs as subject matter experts. They were oil industry experts who had retired from the industry, and most had participated in the reconstruction of the Kuwait oil sector after the first Gulf War. They were brought in to review the Contingency Support Plan, CSP, for Iraqi oil reconstruction. A couple of these experts were retired from oil service companies and had actually worked inside of Iraq during the 1980s. They were American citizens with security clearances. Mike Mobbs was able to rush their security clearances through the Pentagon bureaucracy in just a few weeks so that they could review the draft iterations of the CSP. To save on time and travel expenses, Mobbs coordinated with government installations close to where these experts live so that draft CSPs could be reviewed at a U.S. government skiff in their area. These gentlemen were not compensated for their time, but they were reimbursed for their travel expenses. Others were brought into our office as guests of Makovsky to discuss the Iraq oil sector and to offer suggestions for marketing Iraq's oil. These individuals were not retired. They were active employees of private sector companies, small companies from the Northeast. Only one active international oil company employee entered our skiff. He was working for Hess Oil at the time and was a personal friend of Makovsky. To my knowledge, none of these individuals possessed a security clearance, and none was reimbursed for expenses by the government. The workload for EIPG was divided into two major categories: policy decisions required by the president's cabinet and the contingency plan for Iraq's oil sector. In regard to the first category, policy decisions by the cabinet, there were several policy decisions that needed discussion and agreement at the highest level of the U.S. government before going into Iraq. Some of the issues included the following: what will be our guiding principles and legal considerations? What was the U.S. mission related to the oil sector? How should the oil sector be organized and managed? What were the production targets? How would oil be sold and revenues captured for reconstruction after removing Saddam? What should be the relationship during the interim government with Iraq's neighbors, including Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Kuwait, Syria, and Iran? What should be done about UN sanctions after the fall of Saddam? Our task was to suggest our policy decisions to the agencies and through the NSC for initial presentation to the Deputies Committee. The deputies were the quote-unquote second in charge of each major agency, included Paul Wolfowitz from DOD, Richard Armitage from DOS, and others from the CIA, Treasury, Energy, and the like. Upon approval by the deputies, policy recommendations were presented to the President's cabinet for final approval. Mike Mobbs decided to take each policy decision and assign it to one of the EIPG team members. Some team members were assigned more than one. Each of us took our policy decision and followed a PowerPoint format that we had agreed on in order to present the policy to the decision makers. This format was anywhere from 6 to 10 PowerPoint slides that included a detailed discussion, the pros and cons of options, recommendations, conclusions, and the follow-up required. The original draft was first staffed within EIPG, followed by reviews with Doug Feith. After comments were incorporated, a final product was sent to the NSC so that a review by the deputies could be scheduled. This work started during the first week in November and was completed before the end of 2002. As a person from the industry, I was impressed with the way in which all the stakeholders weighed in with their opinions. Similar to in the industry, some opinions and comments received much more weight than others. One policy was not handled in the same way as the others. It was a policy that involved the relationship with Syria and other border countries after the fall of Saddam. When Mike Mobbs assigned that specific policy, my suspicions were aroused. Mike Makovsky insisted that he take the lead on that particular policy. His aggressiveness during this part of the meeting caused everyone to stop. A pregnant pause.
Basically, this is at least what direct ramifications in his field. Like Makovsky is insisting on taking personal responsibility and overseeing, I would say, like the single most geopolitical aspect of this that has the biggest effect on at least on Israeli politics, Israeli goals, or at least the goals of this particular sect of hardline Israeli-oriented figures. So, Makovsky is insisting on being in the lead in probably the single most directly aspect of this policy as it relates to Syria, which would directly affect what the agenda is of this particular group, with the interests that are being promoted here in terms of going back to this propaganda network and the Israeli aspect of this would be his insistence on being in this. And I wonder if anybody stands up to this insistence. I'm thinking probably not, but we'll see.
All right. Top of page 22, Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. This is chapter 2, Jeremy Rothschild with Greg McCarran, Antedote Deepcore Text. Top of page 22. Quote, the subject was more appropriate for state, but no one objected, and so Makovsky took the lead on that policy. The details are noteworthy. I was in Mobbs' office discussing another subject when Makovsky walked in and handed Mobbs his first draft. Makovsky left the office and Mobbs thumbed through the report quickly. Mobbs looked at me and asked me if we were going to war against Syria or Iraq. Whew. The look on my face must have been enough. Mobbs handed me the multi-page PowerPoint draft that Makovsky had just handed him. I reviewed it quickly and understood Mobbs' comment. It was extremely hawkish toward Syria, and in no uncertain terms, Syria was to be treated as belligerent in post-Saddam Iraq. Makovsky's draft received significant changes before leaving EIPG and was drastically changed after incorporating comments from the DOS. The final presentation approved by the president's cabinet was totally different from Makovsky's initial draft. However, the Syria policy espoused by the OSD civilians a few months later was much closer to Makovsky's initial draft than to the cabinet's final approved version. For example, Paul Wolfowitz verbally reversed written instructions and cabinet-approved policy during a meeting with General Franks in March 2003, before hostilities started. This occurred after Secretary Powell had made his convincing argument to the United Nations that Iraq had WMD. The change made by Wolfowitz led to the destruction of the large pump station that pumped Iraqi oil exports through Syria. This is discussed in more detail later in the book. The second category of our workload was the contingency plan for Iraq's oil sector. Clark Turner, Frosty, and I spent much of our time on this portion of the EIPG mission. It took a few weeks to get this portion moving because of significant political sensitivities about using Kellogg Brown and Root, KBR, for our work. The CEO of Halliburton, KBR, had been Vice President Cheney before the Bush administration. KBR had competed and won the multi-billion-dollar Logistics Civil Augmentation Program, LOGCAP, 3 contract in 2001 to the U.S. Army, to support the U.S. Army in the war on terror in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait, Djibouti, and Georgia. The scope of this contract covered engineering and construction, as well as many other services. It was truly the quote-unquote catch-all logistics contract for the Army, and could especially be used when, quote, time was of the essence, unquote, and the Army did not have 3 to 6 months for a competitive bid process. General Tommy Franks was pushing his CENTCOM staff hard. Franks wanted to be ready for war in mid-February. The actual start date ended up being March 20th, 2003. The decision was made in November to issue a task order under the LOGCAP contract with Halliburton, KBR, to develop a contingency plan for reconstructing the Iraqi oil sector. The decision to use KBR was the best choice that EIPG could make. To their credit, KBR quickly mobilized resources in their Houston office to meet the requirements of their task order. Leading the group for KBR were two former U.S. Army officers. Colonel retired Ray Rodone was the project manager developing the plan. He eventually went to Kuwait with KBR a few months later for the execution of the plan. The lead writer of the plan was Betty J. B.J. Ramos, an Army Reserve officer. KBR also sent Ramos to Kuwait a few months later. Subject matter experts from all over Halliburton and KBR volunteered to be part of the team. All of these volunteers had prior military experience, some for just a couple of years. All KBR employees assigned to the project had U.S. government security clearances. The location of the plan development was in KBR's Houston offices. KBR had to maintain a U.S. government certified security office for their classified work under the log cap contract. All planning material was controlled and secured as if the plans were completed at the Pentagon. All employees knew that discussion of a classified plan outside of the secure office was a violation of federal law. The security of the planning document was taken very seriously by all involved. EIPG's contact on the CENTCOM staff for oil sector planning was Marine Lieutenant Colonel Paul A. Shelton, J5 Plan Section. Paul visited our Pentagon SCIF in November along with Cliff Fowler, CENTCOM J2, for initial introductions. Almost all of our work with CENTCOM was with three staff sections, J2 Intelligence, J3 Operations, and J5 Plans. Paul was a graduate of the Naval Academy and chose a commission in the Marine Corps upon graduation. Cliff was a career civilian intelligence expert who had worked at the CENTCOM HQ in Florida for many years. Since KBR had about 24 subject matter experts in Houston, it was decided that EIPG and Lieutenant Colonel Shelton should travel to Houston to meet with the planners. We did so immediately following the award of the task order. One of the more interesting stories was an initial meeting around a large table with Clark Turner, Frosty, Lieutenant Colonel Shelton, several subject matter experts from KBR, and me. The engineers, subject matter experts were asking a lot of questions, making a lot of demands on the military as to what they considered important and critical. Paul Shelton had been schooled in military strategic planning. He decided to share his military cost-benefit analysis training with the engineers who were requesting so much information. Quote, "Okay, how many 18-year-old lives is it worth for us to have this infrastructure? That's what we're talking about. Killing 18-year-old Iraqis and losing 18-year-old Americans to secure these components. You need to be very sober about this. If it's not critical, don't tell me it's critical because people may die to get it," unquote. There was silence in the room when Paul finished his comment. He got their attention. Such was the very serious reality of planning for war. KBR completed their task and delivered a draft plan to the EIPG offices at the Pentagon a week later. In anticipation of the plan, EIPG scheduled meetings for several industry experts to review the plan. A couple were retired CEOs. The rest were retired executives with oil companies and oil service companies. Almost all of these executives had experience in Kuwait after the first Gulf War. The comments, suggestions, and recommendations made about the KBR original draft plan were excellent. One of the retired CEOs who spent an enormous amount of time and developed several pages of suggestions and recommendations was Phil Carroll. Phil was the former CEO of Shell US, as well as the former CEO and chairman of Fluor Corporation. At 65 years old, he was an elder statesman in the U.S. oil and gas industry, and he was friends with President George H.W. and Barbara Bush. Carroll had spent a few years in the military back in the 1950s. He had taken Army ROTC while a student at Tulane University in New Orleans. This experience added to Phil's value as a key contributor to our contingency plan. His comments, questions, and discussion during our meetings impressed everyone on the team. Knowing that we needed a senior level person from the industry in Iraq during the execution phase, his name was placed at the top of a short list. Mike Mobbs asked me if I thought Phil would be willing to join us in Iraq. I responded, quote, "I don't know how any patriotic American could turn down a personal request from the Secretary of Defense when our country was going to war," unquote. Phil received such a telephone call from Secretary Rumsfeld in March 2003. After all comments and recommendations were incorporated, KBR submitted their final plan. The plan was in 3-ring binders and on CDs. There were 14 appendices that were well over 2,000 pages long. It was an excellent document for a war plan. The format was in the standard military operation order format. Even if we had another year to plan for the oil sector, a significantly better plan for oil would not have been achieved. Much was written on oil well firefighting. Our most likely scenario included 250 well fires in the south and 250 in the north. That would have been our major focus for the first 6 to 9 months. Fortunately, that did not happen. The plan was declassified in 2008 and can be found on a Pentagon FOIA Freedom of Information Act website. Contingency Support Plan, CSP, declassified May 8, 2008. One of the final actions of EIPG was to write the formal action memo from Doug Feith to Secretary Rumsfeld on January 16, 2003, declassified in 2015. This memo assigned the Department of the Army as the executive agent for the oil program. A multi-page PowerPoint presentation was attached to the memo detailing policy issues. Besides appointing the Army, the significant issues covered in the presentation were the following. Point. Petroleum proceeds. The annual Iraqi oil revenues were forecasted to be $16 to $25 billion. The uses of the revenues included the occupation at $48 billion, humanitarian aid of $16 billion, and other demands that resulted in a deficit of $100 to $140 billion per year. Paul Wolfowitz testified before Congress in March 2003 that, quote, "We're really dealing with a country that could finance its own reconstruction," unquote. His testimony to Congress was not consistent with the work we accomplished in EIPG. Next point. Candidates proposed to lead oil sector. Several high-profile Americans were proposed to be chairman of the Iraqi oil sector. The list included James Schlesinger, James Baker, Frank Carlucci, and General Norman Schwarzkopf. Next point. Iraq-Syria pipeline. This is the export pipeline that the cabinet wanted to use as leverage to get Syrian cooperation. Paul Wolfowitz reversed that guidance in a meeting with General Franks a couple of weeks before the war started. Other issues. Next point. Other issues. Guiding principles, legal considerations, and production targets were all covered in the memo. The memo was declassified in 2013 except for the last section on the Iraq-Syria pipeline. That section was redacted from the original declassification. However, the Syria pipeline slide was fully declassified in 2015 in response to my FOIA request. The page directed the military to, quote, "keep the pipeline open only if Syria cooperates on issues of interest to U.S. coalition." It's footnoted. This direction was recommended by the State Department. As mentioned earlier, Paul Wolfowitz verbally reversed those written orders after they were issued, and shortly after Secretary Powell's WMD presentation to the United Nations. He did so during a meeting with General Franks before hostilities started. The main pump station for the pipeline was destroyed in early April 2003. A complete copy of the Feith memo to Rumsfeld is found in my lessons learned work that was completed in 2006 and published for the public in 2016. End of the chapter. End of chapter 2, Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. This is Jeremy Rothko Show with Greg McCarran for Antedote Deepcore Text. And Greg, there's a little bit more in the back of the book that I think maybe just go a little bit more in the background of this specific aspect of Makovsky and Israel and this pipeline and stuff like that, we could do that.
Yeah, it sounds good. And I guess what I would say I got from the main thing that stuck out to me, and I guess this is me following up a little bit on my previous point regarding these particular being put in charge of these matters that are so that would so directly, I think, affect like this the goals and ambitions and policies of interest of this particular hardline contingent that's very very devoted to Israel, or at least to its vision of what or its vision for Israel, so to speak. And it's interesting the combination of the you see the people that are particularly in these positions, like I mentioned before, Makovsky being insisting on being involved directly with the Syrian aspect of this, and somebody even asking the question. I thought it was interesting that the question was even asked: "Are we going to war with Iraq or Syria?" And so I thought about this with relation to Iraq. Well, yes, there was a serious effort to obviously to ensure that the United States Bush administration involved itself into what became what to this human catastrophe in Iraq. At the same time, you've got elements within this particular nest that we've been nest. I'm sorry, this particular cell we've been identifying in terms of the you look at the post 9/11 and you look at the of course people point to PNAC Project of American Century. We're going to talk about the clean break here in the near future. We're going to do another stream, but particularly through the latter document of the as I think it more pertains to this crew, which would be more oriented, I think, with documents such as the clean break and its proposals specifically given to incoming Prime Minister Netanyahu in 1996 and its goal for the region as far as like strengthening at least this hawkish contingency in Israel's hand in the region. And it's interesting that while all this planning for Iraq is going on, clearly these people are directly involved with planning for as it relates to Syria, both with regards to the Iraq war as well as the aftermath of it. And as also mentioned in this article, it's in the also mentioned during this chapter that's not directly related to this book also was the I believe there was a reference to the Lawrence Franklin scandal, which involved Lawrence Franklin, who also was involved in this whole crew with Doug Feith and Richard Pearl of giving American U.S. information about U.S. policy toward Iran to Israel, which was what that whole scale is about. So very clearly, not just Iraq, but very Syria, Iran, etc. Everything that would have an impact in with relation to the Iraq War and American post 9/11 policy was basically in the hands of this network, both direct and extended, as you also see that the direct role of another one of these primary neoconservative hawks, Michael Ledeen, with the Larry Franklin scandals that relates to policy towards Iran. So yes, right here you can see just this very particular, specific group of people basically being enabled and empowered through the office of this circle of people very close with the inclined, particularly with the vice president's office, Cheney, and those around within that circle, both direct and extended, of directly shaping and basically taking out of the hands of like for the most part of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, directly shaping the agendas directed towards these particular countries that would have the biggest impact in terms of this particular regional geopolitical agenda of this core of hardliners that are very devoted to the security and to the best or the strengthening the hand of this particular hardline vision for Israeli policy. So right there in multiple segments, multiple areas, you see this direct influence.
All right, thank you, Greg. How about let's do one more full chapter here, chapter 20. What
Sounds
haunts
good.
me? Is that cool?
Yeah, that sounds great.